How's it going, everybody? My name is Dylan, and today I'm going to be showing you how to install this hidden safe behind a mirror. Now, I made sure that this is a project that anyone can do of any skill level, and that includes you, and I'll even have plans down in the description if you want those. This project starts by getting a few 1x4s. I actually only used 2 of these for this project, and of course, if you want to make the project look a little bit more refined, you can upgrade these to something like oak, but for the purposes of this project, I'm going to be using pine because it's more accessible to more people. Anytime you're working with new lumber, you have to make sure that it's fully dry before you start using the boards. And the way I do this with the pine is I clamp these boards horizontally across my 1x4s so there's airflow on all 4 sides. Then I usually wait about a month before I actually begin the project. The next thing you're going to need is a mirror. I have a link down in the description to this mirror that I used, but any mirror that is 15 inches or wider will work for the project. The one I'm using here is about 16 inches wide.
Look what I got! Yep.
Although this project is designed to accept many different safes of different sizes, I picked up this cheap stalwart safe to use for this project. Of course, you can upgrade this to almost any safe that you want with a few stipulations, but I'll get into that a little bit more later. One of the most important parts of this project are going to be these hinges. These hinges are designed to extend far out past the wall so that the right side of your mirror doesn't scrape the wall. The cool thing about these ones is they're also soft close. As soon as you get close to the mirror being closed, it slows down and sucks the mirror into the wall for you. This way you don't need any other hardware to keep the mirror flush against the wall. I also really like these ones because they're extremely easy to mount. These 2 pieces come apart and you can install them separately if you want, and then you can just snap them back into place. They're kind of fun to play with. The first thing I need to do is cut all of my boards to length using the measurements in the plans, starting with all of the 1x4 framing. To make the construction easy, I decided to just pre-drill and countersink the screws through the outside of the cabinet. Then I can take this large laminated panel and cut 2 more pieces. One of these is going to be flush to the back of the cabinet, and the other one is going to be the same size. However, it needs about a ½ inch removed from 2 of the sides. This will be installed on the back of the mirror, and it needs just a little bit more clearance. Next, I can cut this large 1x10 board into the 4 pieces I need to make the box that holds the safe. Since this box will never be seen, you can kind of just put screws anywhere you want. I constructed this the exact same way I did the main frame of the cabinet. The last thing you want to see is any screws on the inside of the cabinet, so I decided to use pocket holes to connect the safe box to the main cabinet.
Okay, so now this is some of the fun part of trying to design this. Now you can build yours absolutely however you want. I'm trying to figure out if I want the safe to be on the top or if I want it to be on the bottom. I think that what I want to do, and this may be subject to change, is I want to put it in the middle so that I have a shelf on the bottom, and I'm going to put a shelf on the top, because basically what I'm building here is going to end up being a medicine cabinet with a space in the middle for the hidden safe. Now the cool thing about this box is you can build this whatever size you want within reason. I've designed this one around this cheap safe that I bought. I've worked with these before, I really like them, but let's say you want to go with a more robust safe, maybe a bigger safe. Your only limitation is that whatever box you build needs to fit within the dimensions of this frame. Anything you build that fits within this dimension, you'll be able to do the next couple of steps without any issue, as long as it fits in there. And just so you know, if you go bigger, you may have to reduce some of your shelf space. You may not even want any shelf space, depending on what you're trying to do with yours, and so you can just fit yours to fit inside the entire piece if that's what you want to do. But that's the cool thing about this. It's completely up to how you want to build yours.
Once you figure out the exact placement of the safe, you want to go ahead and screw it into place using the pocket holes that are already drilled. I decided mine just needed to be centered, and that means I could just screw it right into place once I found the center. And that gives me enough space for 2 shelves. No matter what size box you put on the back of your cabinet, you'll need to cut a hole the same size as the inside diameter of the box. The easiest way to do this is to screw the box to the back panel first, and then drill a hole and use a flush trim bit to cut the exact size of the hole. Now, I know a lot of people don't have a router with a flush trim bit, so if you have a jigsaw, you'll just need to mark out the inside diameter of your box and then cut to that line. A flush trim bit just makes this 100 times easier. Once everything is cut out, you can flush things up a bit more by sanding the back panel into the same plane as the inside of the box. Now I can connect the back panel to the cabinet by pre-drilling and countersinking just like I did before, and then I can just throw in a bunch of screws. Now that the box is screwed together, we can install the last shelf the way we did the other 2 sections of the cabinet. I just pre-drilled through the side of the cabinet and installed the shelf flush with the top of the square opening on the back of the cabinet. Now this is the only actual shelf that I'm installing, but this gives me 2 shelves that things can be placed on to make sure that it's still usable as a medicine cabinet. Keep in mind this project doesn't have to be a medicine cabinet. This cabinet can be installed in any wall that has 2 studs that are 16-inch on center. My favorite place to add these are on the wall on the outside of the closet. That always seems to give me the best result. And now at this point I can give everything a good once over with the sander. It's a good idea to mark all of the pieces that are screwed together because the next step is we're going to be taking everything apart and we can apply our finish. If you want to make sure that everything goes back together nicely, you need to make sure that they're marked so you know which pieces mate with which pieces. Now I'm going to rush through this finishing process a little bit because I ended up not liking the color that we chose and we ended up painting it, so I'll go over that process instead a little bit later. Also, keep in mind, if you're planning on just painting this project, you don't actually have to take everything back apart the way I did here. But I'll show you all that here in a second. Now, like I said before, I'm going to be using this concealment mirror to replace my current medicine cabinet. So the first thing I need to do is remove the current cabinet that I have there so I have access to this back wall. Anytime you need a specific size cut for something like a cabinet, it's a good idea to mock up one of these cheap 1x2 frames to make sure you're cutting the right size. Unfortunately, as I'll show you in a second, I actually made this one a bit bigger than I was supposed to, so make sure that yours matches the cabinet you're trying to install. I had to fill in a little bit of a gap later, but it all worked out in the end. Now I just need to follow that line with a drywall saw, making sure to stay on the inside of my line so that I can cut out the general shape of the cabinet. Now that I have the drywall out of the way, I can see that the location where I want to put this cabinet has a 2x4 right in the middle of it, so I really can't push the cabinet in either direction, so instead I'm going to have to remove this. Now in my house I know this isn't a load-bearing wall, so I can get away with cutting this out, but I wouldn't suggest anyone else do it this way. This cabinet is designed to fit between 2 studs that are 16-inch on center, so the best way to do this would be to just find a location where you have studs that far apart, and the cabinet should fit right into there. All you have to do is remove a little bit of drywall. I do not recommend anyone else removing anything other than drywall from their wall. Now that I have everything out of the way, I need to add a little bit of framing to the empty spaces between the 2 pieces of drywall. My favorite method for this is to put screws in the top of a piece of 2x4, and that way I can make sure to have something to grab onto as I'm screwing the drywall into the 2x4. Right here is where I realized I cut the hole way too wide, and if you're just cutting to the 2x4s inside the wall already, you shouldn't have any issues like this. After all these years, I still forget to measure twice. I also use this as an opportunity to put a slight round over on all of the drywall. This will come in handy later when putting on the finishing touches. Then when everything is looking nice and clean, I can add a copious amount of spackle to everything. While I wait for the spackle to dry, I can head back out to the shop and reassemble the cabinet. Since everything is already marked, this part goes pretty quickly. It's also a good time to mark out where we're going to be putting our pocket hinges. If you're making this cabinet the same way I did, then all of the measurements for things like the pocket hinges are going to be in the plans. But depending on where your shelves are in the one that you build, you're going to want to place these about a 16th inch in from the edge and just make sure that it's not going to interfere with any of your shelving. So if you think about it, we're basically going to be taking a mirror and turning it into a cabinet door, and a mirror really isn't designed to hold up its entire weight hanging on only one side. So this panel that we're adding to the back of the mirror both acts as our hinging surface and also holds the mirror together, basically turning it into one large panel that we can work with. So we need to start by taking off all of the hardware currently holding the mirror together, and then we can put a generous amount of wood glue on the mirror, then tacking it into place with a brad nailer. If you don't have a brad gun, you can also just use finishing nails. It doesn't really matter what you use to hold it together for now, because the glue is what's going to be doing the majority of the holding. Then it's time to start putting the hinges on. Since we already pre-drilled these holes before, we can just pop the hinges right into place and they can be screwed in right away. You can see that I left the back panel off of the cabinet body, and part of the reason for that is I wanted to be able to put these hinges in the proper location without having to do any measuring. So I can just put this cabinet on top of the panel, lining everything up accurately, and then just screw it directly into place. This saves a ton of time when assembling. And now the back panel can be screwed on for the last time. Once again, I'm finding all of the marks that I made earlier to make sure everything is in the same orientation. At this point, the spackle should be dry. I sanded over all of my surfaces to make sure everything was nice and flush, and then I also used the same sanding block to round over all of the edges of the drywall one more time. Depending on how good of a job you did on that first bit of coverage with the spackle, you may have to do this several times to get a perfect finish. I've noticed in the past that I've had to do this at least twice every time, because as soon as I start sanding, I find a few low spots that need to be filled. The more time you spend on this step, the better the finished result is going to be, so don't skip it. Now here's where things start to get a little bit complicated in my situation. I'm planning on repainting this at some point, and I'm not sure how long that's going to be, and so even though right now I'm saying it's temporary, I've noticed over time those temporary solutions have a tendency to become permanent solutions, and I don't want to leave this a mess. Unfortunately for me, this wall has 3 different colors in it, and I had to match all of those colors as accurately as possible, and I'm not going to show you every single step of that process, because 90% of the time was spent putting paint on the wall and then wiping it back off again because it looked terrible. I eventually did figure out which paints looked best, and so future Dylan, if you're looking for which paint I used on this wall, it was titanium white, mint julep green, and forest green. There, now if I ever have to match these again, it won't take me 3 days. The other issue I ran into was how to get this random pattern onto the wall, and I'm not really sure how the original painters did this, but I found dabbing a crumpled piece of newspaper onto the paint and then blotching it onto the wall ended up giving me a very similar pattern. I think they may have used some sort of a textured roller, but I really don't know how they did it. Either way, this ended up working really well. So I ended up using painter's tape on the sides of the mirror and then just spray painting over all of the finished surfaces of the cabinet. I'll put a link down in the description to the paint I used, but it was sort of this chocolate brown color. I've used the same paint on projects in the past and it always ends up looking so nice when it's done because it sort of mimics a nicer wood like walnut, but of course it doesn't have the nice figure of a good hardwood. It's just a much cheaper way of achieving a similar result. And then when I was done painting, I could use this spray lacquer, and I ended up using 3 coats of this over all of the visible surfaces. Don't forget to remove the hinge hardware when you do this. Now we need to reinstall the hinge hardware on the inside of the cabinet. Do you remember how I said that you can just detach the sides of this hinge? This is where this really comes in handy. I can just screw that little piece of metal onto the inside of the cabinet and then bring the whole cabinet inside for installation. And then I can install the rest of the hinge back on the mirror side. Since I have access to a pin nailer and a brad nailer, I decided to bring this air hose with me as well, and it's always a fun experience to try to feed this through the windows of my house. I always see people using pneumatic tools on the inside of their house, but no one ever shows how the air hose gets there. I know some of you may have one of those little pancake compressors, but does anyone else ever do it this way? At this point, I can finally start sliding the cabinet into the opening of the wall, and since I don't have a mirror in the way, I can slide this in from the back, and that makes everything 100 times easier. Since this was such a tight fit, I ended up cracking some of the spackle just a little bit, but the cracks were so small I decided just to paint over them. If the cracks are small enough like these ones are, the thick paint will actually fill in the cracks just fine and no one will be able to see it. Once everything was in place, I could take the mirror and snap the hinges right back into place. A good tip is to take one of these hinges and back the screws out just a little bit so that they're just a little bit sloppy, and that makes it a bit easier to snap the hinges in place. Don't forget to retighten those screws when you're done. At this point, you can either take finishing nails, or in my case, a pin nailer, and nail the cabinet into the framing of the wall. This cabinet fits so tightly I probably didn't actually need to nail it at all, but the pin nails just give you extra insurance and make sure that nothing ever moves. I ended up adding right around 10 pin nails for this. The last step is to slot the safe into place, and that could be done from either direction. Because I had room to get behind the cabinet, I pushed mine in from the back, but you should know that you can also push this in from the front if you don't have as much room. When I built the box for the safe, I made sure that it would fit so tightly that it wouldn't budge once it was in place, but just for a little bit of added insurance, I also put this little block of wood on the back to make sure that the safe wouldn't get pushed any farther backward into the closet. Now, some of you probably aren't going to like the way this safe sticks out of the back of the wall here, but I chose this location specifically because I'm in the middle of doing a bathroom remodel project, and this whole area is going to end up being walled off, but I'll explain more about that in the next video in the series. As I said before, this project is really something that anyone can do, even if you have no prior woodworking experience. As I mentioned before, I have plans for this project down in the description, and if you're familiar with my larger version of this build, the Tactical Walls Inspired Safe Behind a Mirror project, I have plans to that build as well. So if you want to see that video or the plans to both builds, go and head down to the description and I will have links to everything down there. Thank you all so much for watching. Catch y'all next time.